Everyone who works for my husband has a story. Whispered carefully, and only among trusted company. About the first time they saw him truly frightened, and every single one of those stories involves a rival crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, a debt collected in a language considerably older and colder than money. Almost none of them have a story about the first time they saw him smile. Because for years there simply wasn't one. Not a real one, not the kind that reaches a man's eyes and stays there. That all changed on an ordinary Tuesday evening in our kitchen, 3 full years into our marriage, when Adrian pulled me away from the stove mid-sentence, on hand still faintly smelling of gun oil from the range he'd visited that afternoon, and danced me slowly around the kitchen island to a song playing quietly from my phone. All 4 of his most hardened men stood frozen in the doorway watching a version of their boss none of them had ever been permitted to see. I married Adrian Kovalenko when I was 26 years old, fully aware of exactly what he did for a living, fully aware of the specific, considerable danger that came permanently bundled with his name, and utterly, completely unprepared for how thoroughly he would eventually dismantle every single assumption I had walked in with about what kind of man could actually run an organization like his. I had grown up in a considerably smaller, quieter, far more ordinary world, the daughter of a restaurant owner who had known Adrian's own father only in passing, and our own first introduction had happened at a charity dinner neither of us had particularly wanted to attend that night, seated together entirely by a seating chart neither one of us had any control over whatsoever. He spent that entire first evening asking me careful, genuine questions about my own work restoring old buildings rather than performing the kind of practiced charm I had braced myself for, and it was nearly 2 hours before I even learned, from a nervous waiter who recognized his name, exactly what family he actually belonged to. My own family's reaction to the relationship, once it became clear I intended to actually marry him, deserves its own honest accounting. My father, who had known Adrian's father only through the polite, careful distance restaurant owners maintain with men whose business they would rather not examine too closely, took me aside within days of learning my intentions and asked, with genuine fear rather than judgment, whether I understood exactly what kind of life I was choosing, whether I had considered that loving a man like Adrian meant accepting a permanent, low-grade uncertainty most people never had to carry. My mother said considerably less aloud, but wept quietly in the kitchen for nearly a week. Grief I recognized even then as rooted less in disapproval of Adrian personally, and more in a mother's specific terror of a danger she could not protect me from simply by loving me hard enough. I did not have a clean, reassuring answer for either of them at the time, only the honest admission that I had asked myself the same questions repeatedly during our courtship and had arrived, each time, at the same conclusion, that whatever risk came bundled with Adrian's name was considerably outweighed by the specific quality of attention and care he brought to absolutely everything else about how he treated me. My father eventually came around, slowly, over the following years, won over not by any single conversation, but by the accumulated evidence of a marriage that seemed to genuinely work, though my mother's particular fear never fully resolved, settling instead into a watchful, ongoing vigilance she carried quietly for the rest of her life. I will not pretend the courtship that followed was simple. There were entire weeks that first year when Adrian disappeared without explanation, returning eventually with a tightness around his eyes I learned, slowly and painfully, not to ask about directly. There were nights I lay awake certain I had made a catastrophic mistake, that I had fallen for a carefully constructed performance rather than a real man, that the actual Adrian, the one who existed in rooms I would never be permitted to enter, was someone I would eventually meet and be unable to love. I told him this once, early in our engagement, sitting on the edge of his enormous, impersonal bed in an apartment that still felt more like a fortress than a home. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, and then told me, plainly, that the man in those rooms and the man sitting beside me were the same man, that he had simply learned, from a very young age, exactly which rooms required which version of himself, and that he had no intention of ever bringing the wrong version home to me. We married the following spring, a ceremony considerably smaller and more private than his position technically required. Guarded by men I did not yet know the names of, watched by a mother who wept less from joy than from a specific, complicated fear she never fully articulated. Adrian's own mother had died when he was young, a fact he mentioned only once, briefly, in the early months of our marriage, and I understood, gradually, that whatever tenderness existed in him had been built almost entirely without a model, constructed alone, piece by piece, in a world that actively punished softness as a liability. Adrian told me the fuller story of his father's death only once, on a difficult anniversary roughly 2 years into our marriage, sitting quietly on our back porch late into the evening, long before our daughter's eventual arrival was even a distant, unplanned future either of us had seriously discussed yet. His father had been killed in a territorial dispute when Adrian was 19. A violent, sudden loss that left him, practically overnight, responsible for an organization considerably larger and more dangerous than a teenager should ever have had to inherit. He told me that the specific grief of that loss had never fully had room to exist properly. The demands of the position arrived so immediately and so relentlessly that he had learned, within weeks, to compartmentalize the grief itself into something manageable enough not to interfere with decisions that carried genuine life or death consequences for the people depending on him. He said he had not actually cried, over his father's death until nearly a decade later, alone in this same house, shortly after our wedding, finally safe enough for the first time in his adult life to let something that heavy surface without immediately needing to perform composure for someone else's benefit. I asked him, that same quiet evening, whether he had ever genuinely resented the childhood that loss had so abruptly ended, the specific unfairness of inheriting a violent, demanding legacy before he was even old enough to have any real say in accepting it in the first place. He told me the resentment had existed, briefly, in his early 20s, before settling into something closer to simple acceptance, understanding that the specific shape of his life had never actually been a choice so much as an inheritance, and that his own responsibility now was not to resent the inheritance but to decide, deliberately, what kind of man he became while carrying it. He said meeting me had clarified that decision considerably, that he had spent years assuming the demands of his position made genuine domestic tenderness an impossible luxury, until watching me build an ordinary, warm home around both of us had proven that assumption simply wrong. That first year of marriage taught me more about Adrian's actual character than the entire courtship had. I learned that he insisted on personally checking every door and window in our home each night before sleep, not from paranoia, but from a specific, careful devotion to his safety he refused to delegate to anyone else where I was concerned. I learned that he remembered, with unsettling precision, every small preference I had ever mentioned once in passing, the specific way I liked my coffee, the particular side of the bed I favored, the exact restaurant booth I found least drafty. I learned that his men, the ones who guarded our property and accompanied him to meetings I was never told the details of, watched him with a wary, careful respect that had very little room in it for anything resembling warmth, and that this arrangement suited Adrian perfectly, a boundary he maintained deliberately, keeping the softer parts of himself locked away from every single person except me. Dmitri had been with Adrian since they were both teenagers running small errands for Adrian's father, and by the time I entered the picture, he had become something between head of security and closest friend, the one man permitted to speak plainly to Adrian without fear of consequence. Dmitri watched me in those early months, with an assessing caution I initially mistook for hostility, until I understood it was actually a kind of protective vigilance, a man who had spent 2 decades watching his closest friend build walls brick by brick, now uncertain whether I represented a genuine crack in those walls, or simply another person who would eventually disappoint him. There was a particular test, though I did not fully recognize it as one until much later, when Dmitri quietly arranged, without Adrian's own knowledge at the time, to have me discreetly followed for nearly 2 entire weeks during our engagement, a standard precaution he later explained was routinely applied to anyone who came close enough to Adrian to genuinely matter, verifying that I was truly who I claimed to be rather than some elaborate liability planted deliberately by a rival organization. I learned about this surveillance only after our wedding, when Dmitri mentioned it almost offhandedly, and I remember the specific, complicated mixture of unease and understanding that news produced in me. Unease at having been quietly investigated without my knowledge, understanding that the same careful vigilance protecting me was simply how safety functioned in the world I had chosen to join. Dmitri told me, when I asked him directly about it, that he had reported back to Adrian with unusual, genuine relief, having found nothing at all in those 2 full weeks except a woman who seemed to actually love his friend for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with money or power. A report, he said, had visibly eased something in Adrian he had not previously realized was wound quite that tightly. There was a smaller, quieter moment during that same early period that I think about often. An evening when Dmitri, still cautious around me at the time, mentioned in passing that Adrian had once told him, years before we ever met, that he did not expect to marry at all, that a man in his position carrying that much accumulated danger owed it to any potential partner not to invite them into it in the first place. Learning this later, secondhand, helped me understand more fully why our early courtship had felt, at times, like watching a man argue quietly with his own long-held convictions, weighing a genuine, growing feeling against a self-imposed rule he had apparently maintained for years before I arrived to complicate it. I asked Dmitri once, years later, what exactly had convinced him personally, beyond the surveillance report, that I belonged in Adrian's life for good. He told me it was a much smaller moment than I expected, an early dinner at our home, when a business associate had made a careless, dismissive comment about women who married into organizations like Adrian's, clearly testing whether I would simply absorb the insult quietly the way some partners learn to. He said I had responded immediately and plainly, refusing to let the comment pass unchallenged, and that watching Adrian's quiet, approving pride in that moment, rather than any embarrassment at my directness, told Dmitri everything he needed to know about the kind of partnership Adrian actually wanted, considerably more resilient than the decorative arrangement some of his peers apparently settled for. The kitchen dance itself happened on an entirely unremarkable evening. Nothing about that particular Tuesday distinguishing it from 100 others, except the small, accumulated exhaustion of a difficult week, finally catching up with both of us simultaneously. Adrian had returned home later than usual, having spent the afternoon at a meeting he described only as tense, and I was standing at the stove finishing dinner when he came up behind me, still in the dark suit he wore for the meetings I was never invited to, and simply wrapped his arms around me from behind without saying anything at all. I asked him, half turning, what the meeting had actually involved, and he told me quietly that he would rather not discuss it, that he simply wanted 5 minutes of something that had nothing to do with any of it. The song was already playing quietly from my phone, something old and slow my mother used to hum while cooking, and Adrian, without any particular ceremony, simply took the wooden spoon from my hand, set it on the counter, and pulled me into a slow, unhurried dance around the kitchen island, his hand warm and steady against the small of my back, his forehead eventually resting against mine as we moved in a loose, unpolished circle that had nothing to do with any formal steps either of us actually knew. I remember laughing softly at the specific absurdity of it, a man capable of genuine violence swaying gently with me between the stove and the refrigerator, and I remember him laughing too, a low, unguarded sound I had heard perhaps twice before in 3 years of marriage. Neither of us noticed Dmitri and 3 other men arriving at the kitchen doorway until the song had nearly finished, having come to deliver an update Adrian had requested earlier that evening. I glanced up over Adrian's shoulder and caught the exact moment Dmitri's expression shifted. A man who had known Adrian for over 20 years, who had watched him negotiate with genuine monsters without a single visible flicker of fear, standing utterly still in a doorway, watching his closest friend smile in a way none of them had ever personally witnessed. Adrian noticed a beat later, going slightly rigid before recovering, releasing me with a small, self-conscious clearing of his throat, though he did not look remotely embarrassed, simply amused at having been caught in a moment he had never particularly tried to hide, only never had reason to perform in front of an audience before. Dmitri told me, weeks later, over coffee while Adrian was occupied elsewhere, that he had known Adrian since they were 14 years old, had watched him bury his own father at 19 and step immediately into responsibilities that would have broken most grown men, had watched him build, methodically and without complaint, an entire organization's worth of careful, controlled composure. He said watching Adrian dance in that kitchen, unguarded and visibly happy, had done something to his own understanding of his oldest friend that 2 decades of loyalty had never quite managed, confirmation that the composure was armor rather than the man himself, that somewhere underneath everything Adrian had built, a genuinely soft, capable of joy person had simply been waiting for someone safe enough to let it surface. I remember standing there afterward, once his men had finally filed quietly out with a series of small, respectful nods that told me they understood exactly what they had just witnessed without either of us ever needing to address it directly aloud, feeling a specific, unexpected warmth settle slowly over the whole evening that had nothing at all to do with the dinner still cooling patiently on the stove behind us. I asked Adrian himself, that same night once his men had finally left, why he had never once mentioned enjoying dancing in 3 years of marriage. Curious what other small, unexpected pieces of himself he had simply never thought to offer. He told me honestly that he had not particularly enjoyed dancing before that evening, that the entire thing had been less about the music and more about needing, suddenly and specifically, to hold something steady and good after an afternoon spent doing the opposite, and that I had simply happened to be the steady good thing closest at hand. I told him that was, without question, the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, while also being the least romantic possible way of saying it, and he laughed again. That same low, unguarded sound, twice now in one evening, personal record I intended to keep chasing for the rest of our marriage. The months following that kitchen dance brought a specific, gradual shift I had not anticipated. Small moments of unguarded tenderness beginning to surface more frequently, as though that first witnessed crack had somehow given Adrian permission to let a few more slip through in front of people he trusted. Dmitri mentioned, months later, that Adrian had started actually humming, quiet unconscious fragments of melody, while reviewing paperwork in his study. A habit none of them had ever once witnessed before that particular Tuesday. I found myself wondering, hearing this, how many other small pieces of the man I loved had simply been waiting, patiently, for enough accumulated safety to finally emerge. There was a difficult stretch, roughly a year after the kitchen dance, when a rival organization's aggression toward Adrian's territory escalated into something considerably more serious than his usual careful business dealings. Several tense weeks during which he insisted on additional security around our home and grew visibly, uncharacteristically distant, retreating back into exactly the armored composure I had first met at that charity dinner years earlier. I remember the specific loneliness of those weeks, watching him disappear behind walls I had genuinely believed, perhaps naively, we had already dismantled together. The specific incident that triggered that entire tense stretch involved a shipment dispute that escalated, over the course of a single difficult week, from routine business friction into something considerably more personal. The rival organization apparently deciding that testing Adrian's resolve meant testing how close they could get to the things he actually cared about. I remember the particular morning Dmitri arrived at our house before dawn, uncharacteristically urgent, informing Adrian that a car had been spotted parked near our daughter's future preschool, watching from a distance in a way that read, unmistakably, as a deliberate message rather than coincidence. I had never before seen Adrian move with quite that specific, controlled speed. A version of him I recognized intellectually existed, but had genuinely never witnessed directly. Making calls in a low, clipped voice I did not recognize, arranging additional protection with an efficiency that revealed, more clearly than anything else in our marriage, exactly how seriously he took threats against the people he loved. That particular conflict resolved within 10 tense days, resolved in ways involving conversations I was not present for and did not ask to have detailed for me, though I understood, from the visible relief in Dmitri's posture once it concluded, that the resolution had required Adrian to demonstrate exactly the kind of controlled, decisive strength that had built his organization's reputation in the first place. I asked him directly, one particularly tense evening, whether the danger meant he needed to become, permanently, the version of himself that did not dance in kitchens, uncertain whether the softness I had witnessed was simply a temporary luxury his actual life could not sustainably afford. He told me, that evening, sitting heavily at our kitchen table with a weariness I rarely saw him show, that the composure was never meant to replace the softness, only to protect it, that a man in his position who let danger reach the people he loved had failed at the one job that actually mattered more than any business dealing, and that retreating behind careful walls during genuine threat was not abandoning our kitchen dance, but specifically defending the possibility of ever having another one. The rival conflict resolved itself within several more difficult weeks, resolved in ways I understood only in vague, careful outline, and did not ask to understand more precisely, and Adrian returned, gradually, to the version of himself capable of humming over paperwork and pulling me into unplanned dances whenever a hard day required something steady to hold on to. Dmitri, watching this same pattern repeat itself over the following years, told me once that he had come to think of our kitchen as something closer to sacred ground within the organization's unspoken geography, specific physical space where the boss's careful armor was permitted to fully come off, a boundary the men had learned, without ever being explicitly told, to respect completely. I learned gradually that this reputation had spread quietly beyond just Dmitri, that newer members of Adrian's organization, men who had never personally witnessed the original kitchen dance, nonetheless understood through some unspoken institutional knowledge that our home represented territory where a different, gentler version of their otherwise formidable boss was allowed to exist without judgment or exploitation. We welcomed a daughter 4 years into our marriage, and I found myself, watching Adrian hold her for the first time in the hospital, understanding something about his own carefully guarded tenderness that I had not fully grasped even after the kitchen dance and everything that followed it. He held her with a specific, careful reverence, as though something in him recognized immediately that this particular vulnerability could never be armored the way his own had been, that she would need, from the very beginning, a father who let his softness show far more readily than he had ever previously allowed himself. Pregnancy itself had been its own quiet negotiation, Adrian growing visibly more protective as the months progressed, insisting on additional precautions I sometimes found excessive, until I finally asked him, directly, whether the specific intensity of his worry traced back to the shipment dispute and the parked car outside a preschool that did not yet even have a child enrolled in it. He admitted quietly that it did, that the abstract danger of his world had become considerably more concrete once he understood a genuinely defenseless new person would soon be depending on him for safety, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making certain she never once had to learn, the way he had, exactly how dangerous that world could reach. I remember the specific fear that gripped me during a difficult stretch of labor, complications the doctors described carefully but seriously, And I remember Adrian's hand gripping mine with a tightness I had never felt from him before, a man accustomed to controlling every variable in every room he entered, suddenly and completely powerless against something no amount of careful planning or controlled force could influence. Our daughter arrived healthy after several genuinely frightening hours, and I watched Adrian's entire body seem to finally exhale once the doctor confirmed she was fine. A physical release of tension I recognized later as the exact opposite of the controlled composure I had married 3 years earlier. I remember a particular evening, our daughter perhaps 2 years old, when Adrian came home from an unusually difficult day and found her already dancing, unprompted, in the very same kitchen spot where he had first pulled me into that unplanned dance years earlier, spinning in small, unsteady circles to a nursery song playing from her own small speaker. He stood in the doorway for a long moment simply watching her, and then joined without a word, lifting her onto his feet the way parents do, moving slowly around the kitchen island in the exact same loose, unpolished circle he and I had once traced there. Our daughter laughing delightedly at the novelty of dancing several feet off the ground in her father's careful arms. There was a particular afternoon, our daughter perhaps 5, when she asked me directly why her father sometimes left for work wearing what she called his serious face, a small, perceptive observation that told me she had already begun noticing the specific boundary between the two versions of him I had spent years learning to navigate myself. I told her, as honestly as her age allowed, that her father's work sometimes required him to be very serious and very careful, but that the face he wore at home, especially in our kitchen, was the truest one, and that she was lucky enough to see that truest version considerably more often than most people ever got to. I found myself, watching her grow, deliberately protecting her from the specific dangers of Adrian's world for as long as reasonably possible, while also refusing to let her grow up believing her father's tenderness was somehow separate from or in spite of his actual strength. Adrian handled this particular balance with more grace than I expected, answering her occasional questions about his work with careful, age-appropriate honesty, rather than either frightening specificity or dismissive deflection, gradually building, over years rather than in any single conversation, an understanding she could actually hold without either terror or naivety. I remember a particular conversation with my own mother, our daughter perhaps 4 at the time, when she finally asked me directly whether I regretted, even slightly, the specific life I had chosen all those years ago at that charity dinner. I told her honestly that I did not, that whatever risk I had accepted marrying Adrian had been more than matched by the particular depth of tenderness I had been given in return. A trade she still did not entirely understand, but had by then mostly stopped actively fearing. There was a particular birthday, our daughter turning 7, when she requested, specifically, that her father teach her to dance properly in the kitchen rather than simply being carried around on his feet the way toddlers are, and I watched Adrian spend the better part of an entire Saturday afternoon patiently teaching her actual steps, counting quietly under his breath, adjusting her small hands with a careful precision that reminded me, watching him, the same controlled patience Dmitri had once described him using to defuse a genuinely dangerous territorial standoff years earlier. She mastered a simple box step by the end of that afternoon, delighted with herself in the particular way only a 7-year-old can be, and Adrian told me afterward that teaching her had been, without close competition, one of the more satisfying afternoons of his entire life. He mentioned, that same quiet evening, that he already intended to dance with her again someday at her eventual wedding, a thought that visibly moved him even as he said it aloud for what seemed like the very first time. A man who had spent his entire adult life planning carefully and methodically for danger now quietly planning, with that exact same seriousness, for an entirely different kind of milestone still decades away in an uncertain future. I found the specific tenderness of that small admission more moving than almost anything else he had ever told me, evidence of exactly how thoroughly our daughter's arrival had expanded the emotional range he allowed himself to openly inhabit, a range that continued, year after year, to surprise even me, someone who had already spent a decade learning the full shape of this man's carefully guarded heart. I think, looking back across the whole span of our marriage now, that the specific magic of that first kitchen dance was never really about the dancing itself, but about the sheer, uncomplicated permission it granted both to Adrian, and eventually to everyone who witnessed even second-hand accounts of it, to believe that a man capable of real danger could also, simultaneously and without contradiction, be capable of real, undefended joy. Dmitri happened to be present for that particular moment too, having arrived to discuss some minor logistical matter, and I watched him take in the scene with an expression I had come to recognize well by then, something between fond amusement and genuine, quiet gratitude for having lived long enough to witness his oldest friend become exactly this. He told me afterward, once Adrian had carried our sleepy daughter off to bed, that watching the kitchen dance repeat itself across a second generation had confirmed something for him he had suspected, but never quite trusted that whatever Adrian had built with me in that kitchen years earlier was not a temporary crack in his armor, but a genuine, permanent expansion of who he actually was. There was a harder season roughly 6 years into our marriage, when Adrian's own uncle, Victor, a man who had spent years quietly resenting the leadership position that passed to Adrian rather than himself, began a slow, deliberate campaign to undermine Adrian's standing within the organization, questioning his judgment in front of senior members, suggesting privately that a boss capable of dancing in his kitchen with his wife lacked the necessary hardness for the position he held. Victor had been Adrian's father's younger brother, passed over for leadership at the time of his brother's death specifically because the older members of the organization had trusted a 19-year-old grieving son more than they trusted an ambitious uncle whose loyalty had always seemed to serve his own interests first. Adrian told me, once the full extent of Victor's campaign became clear, that he had spent years extending his uncle considerable patience specifically out of respect for his late father. Patience Victor had apparently interpreted as weakness, rather than the genuine family loyalty it actually was. I remember the specific tension of that entire season. Dinners where Victor's carefully needling comments about Adrian's supposed softness sat uncomfortably alongside surface-level family cordiality, performance of civility neither man particularly believed in anymore. Campaign escalated gradually, Victor first testing his standing with smaller senior members before eventually attempting, at a larger gathering of the organization's most influential figures, to directly challenge Adrian's fitness for continued leadership, citing the widely circulated story of the kitchen dance as evidence that Adrian had grown, in Victor's careful phrasing, too domesticated for the position his father had once held. I was not present for that particular confrontation, but Adrian described it to me afterward with a controlled, careful precision that told me more about how seriously he had taken the challenge than any visible anger could have. I watched Adrian navigate this particular challenge with a specific, deliberate patience I found remarkable given the personal nature of the attack, refusing to publicly defend the softness his uncle was weaponizing against him, trusting instead that the men who actually knew him, who had witnessed his competence in genuinely dangerous situations firsthand, would not mistake his tenderness at home for weakness anywhere else. Dmitri, I learned later, had been instrumental in that particular conflict's resolution, standing before the organization's senior members and describing, in careful detail, a specific incident from several years earlier when Adrian had negotiated a genuinely dangerous territorial dispute with a rival organization, resolving it through a combination of calculated patience and controlled, precise force that had saved considerably more lives than a more impulsive leader would have managed. Dmitri told the assembled men that the same patience that let Adrian wait out a room full of armed rivals without flinching was, in his own considered opinion, exactly the same quality that let him hold his own daughter gently enough not to wake her. That softness and strength were not opposites in the man they all worked for, but simply two expressions of the exact same underlying discipline. Adrian's uncle's campaign lost momentum within weeks, and the specific respect the organization held for Adrian afterward, I came to understand, had actually deepened rather than diminished, precisely because his men had finally been given permission to see the softness as evidence of strength rather than its absence. I asked Adrian, once that particular difficulty had fully resolved, whether he had ever genuinely worried the campaign against him might succeed, whether some part of him regretted letting his men witness that first kitchen dance all those years earlier, given how directly it had eventually been used against him. He told me, without hesitation, that he had never once regretted it, that a position built entirely on fear rather than genuine loyalty was never actually stable to begin with, and that the men who ultimately stood by him during his uncle's campaign had done so specifically because they trusted a boss capable of real tenderness, more completely than they would ever have trusted one who performed hardness in every single room without exception. Victor left the organization entirely within the year, relocating to a considerably smaller operation in another city, rather than continue serving under a nephew whose leadership he had failed to unseat. And Adrian characteristically arranged for the departure to happen with more generosity than Victor's campaign had probably earned him, settling old family business quietly rather than turning the conflict into the kind of permanent, violent rupture that would have been considerably easier to justify. I asked him why he had extended that particular mercy, and he told me that his father had loved his brother despite everything, and that honoring his father's memory meant refusing to let Victor's own choices turn into an excuse for cruelty Adrian did not actually want to become known for. Dmitri told me, once the whole affair had settled, that Victor's campaign had actually accomplished something he doubted Victor ever intended, cementing among the organization's senior members a genuine, considered respect for Adrian's specific style of leadership, controlled strength paired openly with real tenderness, rather than the older, more brutal model Victor himself represented. he said. Several senior members who had previously kept a cautious professional distance from Adrian began, in the months following Victor's departure, treating him with a warmer, more genuine loyalty, having watched him handle a deeply personal betrayal with exactly the same measured control he brought to any other serious threat. There was a particular anniversary, our 7th, when Adrian arranged, with considerably more elaborate planning than his usual understated style, to recreate that original kitchen dance in full, having the same song cued and waiting, having sent our daughter to stay with my mother for the evening, having personally prepared the same simple dinner I had been cooking that first Tuesday years earlier, down to details I hadn't realized he'd remembered at all. I found him standing quietly at the stove when I finally arrived home that evening, an image so genuinely surreal, given everything I knew firsthand about the actual demands of his days, that I stood there in the doorway for a long moment, simply absorbing it before he even noticed me standing there. I asked him, once I finally recovered enough to speak, how he had possibly remembered the exact dinner I had been cooking on a completely ordinary Tuesday 7 years earlier. Certain even I could not have reconstructed those specific details without checking old photographs. He told me, almost sheepishly, that he had actually written the entire evening down in a small notebook shortly after it happened, uncertain at the time why the impulse to preserve it so precisely had felt so urgent. Only understanding years later that some part of him had recognized, even then, that he was recording the exact moment his life had genuinely changed shape. He showed me the notebook afterward, a small worn leather thing I had never once seen in 7 years of marriage, filled with brief, careful entries documenting small moments he apparently found significant enough to preserve, most of which I had no idea he had been quietly recording all along. Dmitri, learning about the notebook secondhand sometime later, told me it did not particularly surprise him that he had always suspected Adrian carried a considerably more sentimental interior than his careful public composure ever revealed, evidenced by small things over the decades that most people simply never noticed. The specific care with which Adrian preserved his father's old watch, the deliberate way he always sat facing the door at restaurants not purely from tactical habit, but because his father had once told him a man should always be able to see everyone he loved arrive safely. I found myself, hearing these small accumulated details, understanding Adrian's tenderness as something considerably deeper and far more long-standing than that single kitchen dance had first revealed to me, a quality that had simply been waiting, patiently and quietly, for a genuinely safe enough context to finally become visible to anyone at all. He told me, that evening, pulling me once again into the same slow circle around the same kitchen island, that he thought about that original Tuesday more often than I probably realized, that it remained, 7 years and considerably more danger later, the exact moment he had first understood he could actually be both things at once. The man capable of the world he ran, and the man capable of this particular kind of unguarded joy, and that he had no intention of ever letting either version quietly disappear. Dmitri retired from active security work roughly a decade into my marriage, having earned, through decades of loyal service, a quieter position advising rather than guarding, and he told me, at the small gathering Adrian arranged to mark the transition, that the image he intended to carry with him into that quieter chapter was not any of the genuinely impressive displays of strength he had witnessed Adrian demonstrate over the years, but that first, entirely unguarded kitchen dance, boss laughing in a way none of them had ever seen, 4 grown men frozen in a doorway watching something none of them had realized they needed to witness until it was already happening in front of them. At that same retirement gathering, one of the younger men who had joined Adrian's organization only recently, too late to have witnessed the original kitchen dance himself, asked Dmitri directly why the story had become such a significant piece of the organization's internal folklore, curious what exactly made one ordinary domestic moment carry so much weight among men accustomed to considerably more dramatic stories. Dmitri considered the question seriously before answering, telling the younger man that most organizations like theirs ran entirely on fear, a leader's power measured purely by how much dread he could produce in a room, and that watching Adrian be simultaneously capable of genuine, undeniable danger and genuine, undeniable tenderness had taught an entire generation of his men something considerably more valuable than fear ever could. That real strength did not require the constant performance of hardness to remain legitimate. I asked Adrian himself, years after that retirement gathering, whether he ever worried that story circulating so widely through his organization eventually made him seem, in Victor's old phrasing, too soft for the position he held. He told me he had stopped worrying about that particular perception sometime around his uncle's failed campaign, having watched firsthand that the men who mattered, the ones whose genuine loyalty actually meant something rather than the ones who simply feared him, respected him more rather than less for the tenderness they had witnessed, and that he had come to understand real authority as something built on trust rather than dread, a lesson he said he intended to make sure our daughter learned considerably earlier in her own life than he had learned it in his. There was a particular case, roughly 9 years into our marriage, when our daughter, then 8 years old, overheard an older cousin at a family gathering describe her father's business in vague, uneasy terms clearly meant to be discreet but landing, instead, confusing and frightening for a child sharp enough to notice the careful evasion. She came to me afterward, troubled, asking directly whether her father was a bad man, a question I had known, somewhere, would eventually arrive, but had not fully prepared myself to answer in the moment it actually did. I told her, as honestly as I judged appropriate for her age, that her father made difficult choices in a difficult world, that some of what he did was not something polite conversation easily accommodated, but that nothing about his work changed the fact that he was, without any qualification whatsoever, one of the most genuinely loving fathers she would ever meet. Adrian, learning about that conversation later that evening, sat with our daughter for a considerable while, longer than I had ever seen him spend on a single conversation with her, answering her careful, searching questions with a patience and honesty I had not necessarily expected given how carefully he usually guarded details of his actual work. He told me afterward that he had made a deliberate choice, in that conversation, to let her see slightly more of the real shape of his life than he had originally planned to reveal at her age, reasoning that a daughter old enough to ask the question directly deserved an answer built on trust rather than convenient omission, provided the answer for that danger where it belonged, and never let it touch her more concretely than that. I think often now about the woman I was at that charity dinner all those years ago, uncertain whether the man I was falling for actually existed beneath whatever performance the evening required, or whether I was simply constructing a version of him I needed to believe in. I understand now, watching our daughter occasionally still request kitchen dances of her own, both from her father and increasingly from me, that the performance and the man were never actually separate things at all, that Adrian had simply spent years learning which rooms could safely hold his real self, and that our kitchen, from that very first unplanned Tuesday, became the room where the walls came down completely, witnessed by men who had genuinely never expected to see their boss smile, and who understood, watching him, exactly what they were actually protecting all along. It was a particular evening, roughly 11 years into our marriage, when a young new recruit, barely out of his teens and clearly nervous about his first real assignment within the organization, found himself posted briefly near our home and happened to glance through a lit window at exactly the moment Adrian pulled me into an unplanned dance after a long, difficult day. Dmitri told me the young man had come to him almost immediately afterward, visibly shaken, asking whether what he had witnessed was actually real, whether the boss everyone described in careful, respectful, slightly fearful terms was genuinely the same man who danced barefoot in his kitchen with his wife on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Dmitri told him, simply, that both versions were entirely real, and that understanding how those two versions coexisted in one man was probably the single most important thing he would learn in his entire career with the organization. I asked Adrian once, fairly recently, whether he ever imagined, back at that very first charity dinner all those years ago, that a single ordinary kitchen dance would eventually become something considerably larger than either of us had intended, a small piece of organizational history repeated across 2 generations and witnessed, now, by considerably more people than the original 4 guards standing frozen in our doorway. He told me he had imagined nothing of the sort, that the entire moment had simply been an honest, unplanned response to needing something steady and good after a difficult day, and that its larger meaning had only ever been assembled afterward by other people watching and drawing their own conclusions about what they saw. Some evenings now, long after our daughter is asleep and the house has gone quiet, Adrian still pulls me occasionally into that same slow, unpolished circle around the kitchen island, no song required anymore, no particular occasion needed, simply the accumulated habit of a decade spent proving, again and again, that the softest parts of a genuinely dangerous man are not a liability to be hidden, but the exact thing worth protecting everything else to keep. His guards, the ones still active, and the ones like Dmitri who have long since stepped back, still speak sometimes, I'm told, about the boss who danced in his kitchen, a story that has apparently become something close to organizational legend, passed down now to newer members who have never personally witnessed it but understand, somehow, exactly what it means about the man they've chosen to follow.